Waiput Chiap, Waihas Kukwest, Piayat Sweet, Kin Sukanakin Kul Inkamapaluk, Si Squeeze Dina Machen, Talikin Limpt Apana Skulhalt Puwikam, Ku Kusqualta, I Siu, Ulf I Timhulau, Ulf I Timu, Lim Kulinchutin to Apana Skulhalt. Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar. My name is Dina Machen. I'm the Indigenous Senior Advisor with the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative. My nation is the Syilx Nation. I grew up in Vernon, British Columbia, and happy to be joining you today. And thank you for joining us today. So we're here to talk about the land and the water and all the living things, as we say in our language. And we really thank you for being here today. Before we begin with the webinar, we'd like to introduce to you our Indigenous Watersheds Initiative team. And I'll start with Julia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia. I am the communications specialist with IWI, and I'm so excited to be here for our first webinar, and thank you all so much for joining us.
Claire?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Sauvage-Mar, and I'm joining from Songhees and Esquimalt territories in Victoria, and I'm also with the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative, and very excited to see you all here this morning. Thanks.
Go ahead, Zita.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Zita Botello, Director of Watersheds BC and the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative, and delighted to be here with the rest of the team. Thank you for the beautiful welcome, Dina, and I look forward to the conversation today.
Thanks. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us. Feel free to put your name in the chat and where you're dialing in from, where you're zooming in from. And also let us know that if you have your community or your organization is working right now on any climate-related initiatives or any wildfire-related initiatives. You know, if your community was impacted by wildfires this summer or in the previous years, we're just really interested to know kind of like the context that local communities are dealing with and the types of things that they're interested in. So Julia, if you want to start the presentation slides. We've just got a few slides just to introduce the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative, and then I'll get into the agenda and introduction for our guest speakers. Thanks, Julia. So we are recording the webinar. There were a few people that indicated to us that they would have liked to have been here today, but couldn't make it. So we will be recording the webinar, but just the informational portion of the webinar, we won't post the Q&A in case there are kind of sensitive information and discussion that is raised. Once we've had time to kind of clean up the document or the recording, we'll post it on our website and we'll let people know when it's available if they're interested in watching. The Indigenous Watersheds Initiative is supporting First Nation communities in British Columbia to advance their vision of watershed health and security. The IWI supports a model of watershed security that is rooted in the long-term resilience, local values, and Indigenous rights and title. It was established in 2020 with a $15 million investment from the British Columbia government, and it is being delivered through a partnership of Make Way and Watersheds BC. And our program will be running for 3 years until 2025 when we expect to wrap up. So in 2022, the province of BC invested $30 million, an additional $30 million into watershed security. 15 million of this is being administered by a partnership of Make Way and Watersheds BC, and the focus really is on Indigenous watersheds and the priorities of Indigenous communities. In 2022, through our round 1 funding, we are supporting a number of projects to lead this Indigenous-led work. In 2023, we launched round 2 of the funds. So this was a public call for proposals, and projects have started just this year. So now that we've had, like all the funding that we have to support projects is now kind of like out into the world. We're getting to do things like this, which is to provide some support to communities and bring communities together to really focus on some of the initiatives and priorities that communities have told us that they want to work on. And I also want to mention that we did have an Indigenous Leaders Advisory Circle that's been working with IWI to help us guide the program and to really make those decisions on project funding. So you can see by the map, the colored dots, like where this funding has gone in British Columbia. So we've been able to support 49 Indigenous-led projects that are working on stewardship and restoration in their watersheds. And the program is really unique in that it's not super prescriptive. It was really wide open for Indigenous communities to let us know the types of things and projects and initiatives that they were interested in working on. So the types of projects really focus on cultural stewardship, restoration, monitoring, fisheries management and resilience, and planning and decision-making. All this information you can find as well on the Indigenous Watersheds Initiative website, which is www.indigenouswatersheds.ca, if you're interested in learning more about some of the projects. So now that all the funding has been granted and it's out in the world doing good things, one of the things that we wanted to do through the program was to offer some sort of continuing support to Indigenous communities through different types of learning and engagement. So this is the work that we're going to be focusing on over the next year and a half or so. We'll be working to support regional peer circles. So where there's interest, working with communities in local areas and in regional areas to bring them together for discussions on various topics. We'll be working to amplify community storytelling. So as communities are doing work and wanting to share this, we can help to share this, your stories through our platforms as well. We'll be hosting some in-person regional gatherings next year, so more information will be forthcoming on that through our communications, but those will be working to support specifically the Indigenous projects that are being granted through the program. And then we're doing things like this webinar series to be able to share learnings and project impacts from IWI funded projects with a broader public audience. So with the webinar series that we're planning, the purpose is really to hold space for Indigenous leaders, communities, and organizations and their project teams to build connections, share knowledge and learnings, and to discuss challenges and solutions relating to First Nation watershed priorities. So we're really happy to have you join us here today for our first webinar on wildfires, watershed impacts and recovery. And really, before we begin, I would just like to take a moment just to reflect upon another devastating year that we've had with wildfires in British Columbia. Just take a moment to remember there were a few wildland firefighters that lost their lives this year in service of this work. So I'd like just to really take a moment to think about like all the men and women that work in this area, that work for the BC Wildfire Service, and that are really working to protect and safeguard our communities, and just to really thank them and honor their service and their work. And also to really think about the devastation to our watersheds and all the plants and animals and living beings in the watersheds as well. So I'd like to just take a moment just to sort of like reflect on that if we can do that. So I'd like to thank our guest speakers today, Kevin Kriese and Russell Myers-Ross. Kevin is a trained forester and planner with a certification in conflict resolution. He's worked for 30 years for the province of British Columbia, including as the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Forests, Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, working to design and deliver land use plans, develop government-to-government agreements with Indigenous nations, and leading organizational change. Kevin has also served as the chair of BC's Forest Practices Board. Kevin's work is really centered on resolving resource conflicts in BC through collaboration and multidisciplinary problem solving. His current interests include the intersection of forest management, climate change, water, and fire. Our second speaker today will be Russell Myers-Ross. Russell is Indigenous to the Silcotin Nation and from the community of Yunesit'in. He has a Master's of Indigenous Governance from the University of Victoria. Russell has served an 8-year term as the elected chief of Yunesit'in government from 2012 to 2020. And in 2 terms, he was influential in the creation of the Dasiko, a developing Indigenous protected conservation area that evolved from the Supreme Court of Canada's Silcotin decision and from 2 Canadian environmental assessments. After the 2017 wildfires, Russell has worked closely with the Gathering Voices Society to organize cultural burns to apply fire to the landscape. And Yunesit'in has worked to develop a fire stewardship program. So Kevin and Russell, thank you so much for being with us today. And we'd like to pass it over to Kevin to kick us off.
Great. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. As Dina said, I'm now with the POLIS Wildfire Resilience Project. I'll move through some slides pretty quick, and it's going to be a segue for Russell, and then we'll come back for me for some final slides. So next slide, Julia. Some of you may be familiar with POLIS because of its work over quite a long time on a whole range of governance issues. We're housed at University of Victoria and have worked a lot on water and watershed resilience. We're now expanding the scope, and I've joined the project to support its work around wildfire resilience, which is the intersection between water and wildfire is really huge. So I'm going to talk briefly about the crisis, what's going on in BC. I'm going to talk about a few things about a primer on wildfire, kind of what leads to impacts in watersheds, introduce what kind of some of the high level impacts are on water. And then the latter half after Russell, we'll talk about proactive solutions and a little bit on how you can recover from wildfire. Next slide. So I don't think anybody needs to, a lot of reminders. It was a really difficult year in BC and Canada for wildfire, but I think this graph, which is actually out of date, just shows the area burned in BC. It's now over 3.5 million hectares, and that's only one metric of sort of the impacts of wildfire, but that's off the charts. And in addition to having, a lot more area burned, we're seeing a lot more severe impacts from fire and all of its concurrent impacts on communities and ecosystems and so on. So I don't think we need to say a lot more other than the wildfire is in a really ramping up significantly, and we're seeing really big impacts compared to what we have historically. This map is just in terms of what that risk starts to look like in BC. I know BC is a really complicated place, but this is a map the province produces periodically called the Wildfire Threat Assessment that shows what areas are at level of risk. And what you see really is most of the interior of BC is at a high or extreme level of risk, largely based on the kind of fuels that we see, driven by a long history of fire suppression combined with climate change. We just have a lot of land in BC that is at high or extreme risk. And that's just like a really critical factor because that stuff means it's going to burn when you get the right climate. This next picture is really just emphasizing the climate feedback loop related to wildfire. Really what we're seeing is climate change is leading to higher temperatures, but also, which means things burn hotter. But second, it's also leading to a longer fire season. So we've got a lot more opportunity to burn. And then third, it's leading to more lightning strikes. Hotter weather equals more so we're getting more fire started. So we've got 3 different kind of concurrent things that are leading to more significant fire, more extent of fire, and more severe fires. And then, you know, if we really, not to be depressing, but the reality is with the future forecast of climate, we're only at the beginning of this increase in threshold effects for fire. And it's hard to project, but there are projections that say that fire will increase even more over the next 20 to 40 years. And some projections are 2 to 4 times as much. So we're only really at the beginning of this change, and it's going to continue to get worse. Next slide. But when we talk about fire in BC, it's actually a really complicated topic because fire is so different across all of BC. So this map just is an oversimplified version of what they call natural disturbance types, which really oversimplifies the fire regime. But it's a good idea to sort of get the picture that it's very variable. So if you look down in that sort of southern interior, what we know as the interior Douglas fir or the ponderosa pine, you have one type of fire regime. And if you go a little further out onto the plateaus and more into the boreal forest, you have a very different fire regime, more characterized by these infrequent, really big fires that rip and basically replace entire stands, compared to that southern interior, much more calm, low severity fire or mixed severity fire. So, and then on the coast, you might not get fires very often at all, or historically have very, very little fire in the very wet parts of the coast. So the first thing we want to sort of emphasize is that whenever we're talking about fire, its impacts and what the solutions are, is it really is specific to the ecosystem. And there's no one size that fits all. So next slide. When we're talking about fire, also people, you know, there's a few basic things that lead to fire impacts. And the first kind of concept from the fire world is this concept of fire intensity. And you'll often hear about a fire as rank whatever. And that's really just a measure of how much energy a fire is producing, how tall the flames are, how fast they're moving, and so on. And in the past, when we had more modest fire regimes, you'd get, you know, a big fire might be a rank 3 or occasionally a rank 4. What we're seeing now with these hotter temperatures combined with drought, combined with more fuel, is we're seeing rank 5 and occasionally even rank 6 fires. And that's when you start to get really, really significantly larger impacts. And it's also when they're a lot harder to fight. You cannot put firefighters in front of a rank 5 or 6, and even a rank 4 fire is often very difficult to fight. So we started to see with climate change a lot more fire intensity. And then next slide, that's going to lead you to another concept that's really important when we're talking about the impacts of fire, particularly on water, is what's the severity. So this picture essentially is 3 different slides of the 3 different categories they use generally of fire severity. Low severity fire on the left is that nice calm fire where there still might be some green trees left, a lot of skips. The ground didn't burn. It might have danced across and burned some needles and some, you know, dry fuels in the ground, but it moves across fairly quickly and doesn't really have a lot of impacts on the soil. Moderate burn severity might see little patches of impact to the soil in the duff layer. Some trees are killed, needles are gone. And on the right side, the one that's probably of greatest concern when it comes to impacts on water is high burn severity, where you start to see the entire duff layer starts to get burned, roots are burned, stumps are burned, and you really have, you know, destruction of the entire forest canopy, nothing much left, woods charred and so on. This is really critical because it's going to lead to, you know, what, how our fire conditions and our landscape conditions starts to impact fire severity, and that then impacts the water, impacts on water. So the next slide. 2 things I kind of want to also just go back and emphasize is that first is fire is part of a healthy ecosystem in BC. So when we talk about impacts, it's important to remember that fire is part of the change, it's part of the dynamics of the impacts. In some senses, fire, when it occurs sort of in the right conditions, is actually healthy for our ecosystems. And we do need to restore good fire, and we're going to come back to that. But what we're seeing is in BC and across much of the globe, actually, is fire is moving outside how it acted historically. And we're seeing a lot more of these high severity fires, high impact fires, high energy fires that cause greater impacts than those ecosystems were accustomed to. So the picture on the right is sort of how you translate from that low intensity fire or high intensity fire into different effects on the landscape, whether that's, you know, different levels of burn severity. And in the past, you often used to get this very much patchwork of some low severity fire, a patch of high severity fire that would renew the forest, but they weren't as extensive as we're seeing today. So what we're now getting is we're getting a shift to a lot more high intensity fire because of that extra fuel, that change in climate, the warmer conditions and the drought. That's leading to more high severity fire. And that's when you start to see these impacts that are moving well beyond what ecosystems have historically seen. So that's a really important concept to think about when you're thinking about what the risk to your watershed might be. Next slide. Quickly moving into the impacts on water. This is a very oversimplified summary, but there's kind of really two big impacts. One is that when you lose your forest cover, you essentially start to affect water interception, snow interception. So you'll see in the little picture, you got a lot of trees before a fire, and then after the fire, particularly again, when you've got greater severity, greater impact on the forest canopy, you have less forest to intercept, and you start to see greater impacts on the hydrograph. So it is well documented. Many of you will be familiar with things like equivalent clear cut area and sort of the whole impact of forestry on the hydrograph. But you're particularly when fires are higher severity and larger. So that's point one. And then point two is this issue that you're hearing a lot about, where fires are so severe that they bake the soil and the gases permeate the soil and actually create an impermeable layer, hydrophobicity. And then what you get is more overland flow with a whole bunch of other impacts. So the kind of two big things to pay attention to is this kind of change to the hydrograph and hydrophobic soils. The next slide summarizes a couple things that then happen in a watershed, and the two I wanted to pay most attention to is the ones down the middle, is that you will see where there's a lot of impact to the forest cover, to the soil duff, and hydrophobicity sort of sets in, that you can see post-fire debris flows start to occur. And you can start to see sediment and carbon redistribution. A lot more sediments exposed, and it starts moving through the watershed. And there's some really interesting work in the States modeling the impact of this on water supply. And it lasts for, 5, 10, 15 years, and it can be quite significant. But I want to just turn it back to a lot of this effect depends on whether you have a high severity fire or not. So if you have a moderate or low severity fire, you're a lot less likely to get that hydrophobicity, and you're going to have less impact on the watershed through affecting the trees. So back to that fire severity concept really influences how much of these kinds of impacts on the watershed you're likely to have. So what that picture also shows is then you can do modeling, and there is some work being done in BC that's, I think, fairly rudimentary, trying to predict after a fire we're going to see these kinds of effects, but we need a lot more work on that. I included a picture here just to sort of land that in today's reality. I was through Squillax to Secwepemc about a month ago and took some pictures of the Bush Creek fire, which is one of these fires that, was very famous because of the impacts on people's homes in the Adams Lake country. And oh boy, it was pretty severe. My wife's an ecologist, so we were wandering around testing hydrophobicity and so on. And this is an area where the forest was severely impacted over very large areas. That picture you see to the left is a ponderosa pine forest where there's essentially no duff remaining, very exposed, coarse soils. And the soil picture on the right is right above the Adams River, one of BC's preeminent spawning grounds, and it's exposed soils that are on quite steep ground and, very significant erosion potential. So that's a real world example of where this very, very hot fire destroyed a significant amount of the canopy and expose the soils, and you're going to see significant watershed impacts from that part of the world. So the next slide is the segue to what can we do about it. I've kind of listed 5 kind of categories, and I'll quickly touch on some of them, but the whole concept is more good fire, and that includes culture and prescribed fire. Fuel management is critical. How you can actually reduce that fire severity. Forest management practices play a role, and then planning, how we can plan around it. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Russell to lead in on the good fire side.
Yeah, feel free to start that video.
This year has been our biggest year for burning at Yunesit'in. We had more than 20 people come out. More than 5 hectares in full, and we burnt more than 50.
I think it showed us, the full capacity of what we could do.
There's been a continued and ongoing program that's been very resilient at Yunesit'in and is growing.
We're working with different community members each year.
What keeps me motivated is that people want to see this work.
So we've had collaborative burns with BC Wildfire Service and Yunesit'in in the past, but this burn was different. It was Yunesit'in leading the way, using their traditional ways of burning, with BC Wildfire Service providing support. So this was a really unique and novel year. During this fall, we had children out from Yunesit'in Elementary School.
Yunesit'in.
And we had the students put fire to the land, and they were very excited. We saw a lot of happy faces and a lot of kids curious about the importance of fire.
I see sometimes the most important thing is that you have young people out on the land.
It was a very physically exerting 2 days out at Deer Creek. It was steep and it was hot, and there was a lot of sweaty people. Through our health and wellbeing program, we're really analysing the effect of fire stewardship on people's health and wellbeing. We're running interviews and surveys. People have Fitbits on just to see how many kilometres they're working through a day. What we see is a lot of happy people, a lot of tired people at the end of the day, but people excited about the work they've done. What we're learning is that this is a really positive thing for the community.
When we take care of the land, we take care of the community, and it provides for us.
Yeah, this is a presentation mostly from my perspective from the Yunesit'in community. Yeah, some of these are just photos that we've been able to capture. Most of them from Josh Neufeld, but yeah, Julia, you could move the slide. This first maybe 2 or 3 slides are just the impact that we had in 2017 with the wildfires that surrounded our community and through our territory. It's a glimpse from up in the air, but these fires were, catastrophic, and some of the pictures that Kevin was able to show are similar to what we experienced. This was a picture of our subdivision, probably consider that rank 5 fire, almost burnt down our subdivision and got very close, and our firefighters, sort of broke ranks and actually stopped it. Out of the 2017 fires, we were able to do a report called the Fire Awakened Us Report, and created a tripartite agreement with the provincial and federal government, to list recommendations on how to prevent this and how to be prepared for the future. This slide is our first year. So we brought, you see on the right top, picture, there's Victor Stephenson on the far right, but he came from Australia and helped a bit of a cultural exchange of just sharing what he knew from his experience in Australia. And this was the first time we applied fire to the landscape, just more as a pilot project. So the next slide is sort of the aftermath. I think that's the spring or early summer of the work that we were able to do. So you can see, you know, the idea is that we mostly focus on grasslands and grass areas, even within trees and forests, but the attempt is to make it as lush as possible, make sure that, you know, the water is able to absorb into the soils, and then it's able to essentially prevent fires from happening from season to season. Wanted to include my daughters. You know, one of the most profound pictures I found with Victor Stephenson was that he shared with us that is just that there's this picture of this grandmother with a grandchild on the line, and sometimes these are the most important pieces of what I want to project is that this is intergenerational work. You know, this is from Indigenous people trying to pass down knowledge and trying to learn at the same time, and that we need to bring our children along with us. And it's also to demystify the idea that fires are a scary thing, and that they're, you know, essentially part of the landscape, part of the way our forests are, you know, they need the fire to regenerate, and that we need our children to grow up around this, learning that it's safe and that they're able to do it and feel responsible for doing this. The next few slides are just like a snapshot of like what areas we're able to burn. So some of them are outlines of areas we want to burn, and some are more the colored version of it, or areas that we have burnt in the last couple of years. Yeah, that's another picture, and yeah, this picture and the next one will show a little bit of the highlights of some of the carbon work that we're able to do in some of our research for the carbon modeling. And then, yeah, this is Naylina. So this is kind of a start of the day. Naylina's sitting beside me, and yeah, we start the day by smudging everyone, and we try to do, you know, everything as Indigenous as possible. Naylina, what was it like being on the, you know, putting fire to the land? What was that first experience like?
Kind of scary because I was afraid it might burn me, but then when I got a bit used to it, it was good.
Yeah. And what did you learn about the fires?
It will help next spring or summer with the grain growth and stuff.
Yeah, and so these other slides, you know, just trying to share experiences that we've had in the community, you know, what it's like and what it's, yeah, our intended effects. Yeah, feel free to slide through some of these. But one of the things that you'll see is that we try to model ourselves a little bit differently from, say, the provincial hierarchy or the kind of military firefighters. And you can see that it's, you know, we try to make more of a community effort around it. We try to have a gender balance. You'll see young people and young women involved. So we're trying to displace kind of that masculine sort of male dominated roles and lines of authority and all that sort of stuff, and, you know, make it more of a community effort that's safe and people feel like they can be involved. Yeah, and you saw sort of in the video, but, you know, each season we try to involve the school children from the school and try to bring them out and keep exposing them to how this could be viewed as safe and something that they can be responsible for later on. yeah, another thought too is just that, you know, a lot of these things are, they're internal processes that we have to go through. Like it's something that we need to learn just to experience. And so, you know, when we started, it was just an idea to pilot this, to prove that we could do it. You know, I think as we went on, we trying to think of like, what is our long-term sustainability? How can we like finance this for the future? How can we keep growing it and keep involving more and more people from the community? And now it's about almost, you know, in a space where we're trying to justify it. We're trying to build research projects around it. And on top of that, we want to build Indigenous knowledge systems where each year it's sort of a place-based understanding that each place that we see that we're building from year to year. So even that picture that we see there, this spring we were just able to drop one match and it burnt the whole area. We just monitored it and it put itself out. So we kind of know from place to place, the more that we go, we can apply a fire and we know the limits of where we can kind of read the area more and more now to where the fire will end and where we should start it. And yeah, another aspect you heard some of our research was on health, and you know, we continue to do like surveys. We have Fitbits on people. We're trying to measure people's ideas about what they feel when they're on the land, how they feel about doing meaningful work as stewards of the land, their happiness, their enjoyment, being with their people and peers, and how they see the work. And it is, you know, for a lot of people, you know, we've dealt with a lot of trauma, and so in some cases it's very peaceful and tranquil. You know, you can get lost in your own thoughts, or let the wind do its thing, or be mesmerized by the fire, and it, you know, it has a different impact on healing, not only the land but the people themselves. Yeah, and I think one thing too is that, you know, when we first come out, you saw even the video, you can see us with shovels and rakes and things like that, and we've slowly turned to like more like learning about how we can make this more Indigenous. So you've seen maybe pictures of us where we're breaking off the branches of fir trees and we're actually using them instead of shovels now. And sometimes we just have one lighter, and we're just learning more how to do backburns and how to read the land to where, you know, where we can apply fire to stop and like a fire that's getting away, or so we're finding better ways to do things where we don't need like water packs and pumps and a lot of unnecessary equipment. And then another aspect of our research that we'll get to here is just the use of camera traps, and just trying to do more baseline studies around the animals that are in the area and learn about the animals that are going to come back. So yeah, I think right now we've got, I think about half a dozen camera traps, and we're just capturing what animals. I think the intent is, yeah, here you see the picture of some of the, so Joniki are one of our researchers, and putting up a camera trap. And the idea is, I think, is that we measure the animals that are coming back, and especially after the burn itself. But also, I think it's sort of led us towards doing more ethnobotany type work of like learning what the plants are, what the relationships are of the animals that are coming back. So, you know, 2017, it's been 6 years since the big fires. Still a lot of impact in our territory, but we're seeing that like birds are coming back. We're seeing squirrels, chipmunks,
wolves, coyotes,
yeah,
deer, bears.
Yeah, you can see it all. And then I think the other aspect is that we are doing research on like carbon. We don't know where that'll go. but we're, the hope is that, that there's room for us to be able to do work and try to figure out how to finance it and look at the cost, the cost of like letting wildfires happen versus doing the prevention work and what that cost is in the long run. Just to sort of shift, I didn't have any pictures of the watersheds themselves, and I know this topic is based on watersheds, but just from, a lot of our community is right next to the river. And we've, the one aspect that I'd emphasize is that, this is preventative work in a sense, and having seen the devastation that happens along the slopes and along the rivers, is that there's such an emphasis on just trying to prevent any damage from happening along because often you have slopes, and this is an area where our fires can't really go, in a sense. Like we don't want to put fires along slopes necessarily. We don't want to put it around spruce or some of the vulnerable trees. And so, a lot of the work is, we want roots to hold the fire or sort of hold the water, and we want to avoid erosion. But some of these areas that we're walking through, we've seen slopes like drift like 2 feet down. We've seen flash flooding. We've seen like sediments like moving and good soils moving around. So there's a lot of damage that can happen. And so, yeah, so that's sort of my message, is just the prevention side of this work is so important. So I think these last couple of slides, just wrapping up, but yeah, you see lots of happy faces.
I know those people.
Some of them, they're long days, and sometimes, yeah, and sometimes, yeah, sometimes it's yeah, there's such hard days, and in some ways we're learning about the landscape. Sometimes, yeah, sometimes it's learning about trees, sometimes it's learning about different plants, and learning about the soils. We're like pulling out soils to see like what the effects are, what seeds are in there, what's coming back. And then we're moving towards more of a stewardship model where we want to do monitoring, even if it's just taking pictures or doing drone flight after the fact, just to see what the impacts are. So yeah, I'll probably end it there, but a lot of this work done with Gathering Voices Society, been working with different foundations and trying to raise funds, and a lot of it we haven't been able to do with government directly. So we've sort of piloted a lot of this work with alternative funding, and we've just, for the most part, we've stayed in reserves, but we've also been working with the ministry in some cases to do burn plans, and in some cases, sometimes we go a little bit beyond our limits to do things. And I think there's another partnership with Yunesit'in where we've actually done it on tidal lands where they have access to their lands to be able to do this work. So thank you very much, and look forward to questions.
Bye.
Okay, I think this is where I kind of close with some other tools. So thanks, Russ. It was a great overview of one part of the good fire, which is Indigenous fire. Next slide. I think I've got a picture. Yeah, cultural fire. Just mentioned there's a ton of Indigenous folks across the province doing this. One up in our part of the world is Gitniao First Nations, and there's just there's a lot of this going on. Next slide. That's Akam First Nation down in the southwest of BC. And you might have heard they had some really successful burns down in the Kootenays area. And the next slide, I want to, separate from the cultural fire that Russ was describing, is broadcast burning or prescribed fire. This is a picture of following logging using fire to reduce the fuel hazard. And what you'll notice here is that there's lots of stuff left over. So this is an example of how the fire is actually pretty light. It's not burning stumps. It's not burning big chunks of the larger course. It's just getting rid of the fine fuels and reducing that fuel hazard. So broadcast burning is going to be a really important tool, particularly following forest operations. Next slide. Fuel management is a huge topic. Back to that sort of challenge of fire, with as much fuel as we have on the landscape, it's not possible to put fire back directly in some places without first dealing with a lot of the fuel. If you put a fire, broadcast burning or prescribed burning into some of these really densely stocked forests, they're going to burn at very high severity. So you need to remove the fuel from the landscape. And the goal of that is to reduce the fire intensity and the fire severity. It doesn't necessarily stop a fire, particularly if a hot fire comes and rages into a fuel managed area, but it brings the fire down. You've got less crown to burn, you've got less fuel to burn, you've got less fuel on the ground, so it's less likely to spread. And sometimes it just slows it down enough that if you are near a community, you can actually get firefighters on the ground and stop the fire. So you're going to hear a lot about fuel management. And again, there's a ton of activity going on. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do fuel management, but it's a critical part of the toolkit. This is an example from my part of the world, up in Wet'suwet'en Community Forest, or what they call a shaded fuel break. And the reason I included this is that fuel management, how you do it, depends on your ecosystem. Back to that whole differences across the province. Fuel management down in that dry southern interior often means just removing sort of ladder fuels, getting rid of some of the smaller stems. But in my part of the world, it's more subboreal and boreal forests, and they actually have to reduce crowns. So they actually see this concept of a shaded fuel break along a road where they're trying to reduce crown density. So it's a different example of the kind of fuel management, and it's very region specific or ecosystem specific what actually works. Next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about planning, because aside from reducing fuel, introducing different prescribed fire, we're gonna have to plan our landscape so that those activities occur at the right places. You can't treat everything. It's just really expensive. There's not enough people. There's going to be limits, and you're going to have to prioritize where you go. And there's a lot of research in the States. You don't need to treat everything. You just need to treat enough that it brings your fire back down into that sort of historic fire regime. So there's a ton of land use planning and fire resilience planning tools that integrate the kind of protection we need around our homes, the kind of protection we have right next to our communities, what's known as the wildland urban interface, and this more landscape level protection where you're looking at preserving particular important sites or working in watersheds to reduce the overall risk to watersheds. So I think there's a really important role for planning. There's some emergent kind of processes for bringing fire into planning in BC. And what I want to point to that the province is focusing on is this forest landscape planning, and there are partnerships with Indigenous nations to bring forest landscape planning into some new places. I think they just announced yesterday that where the 5 next forest landscape plans will be, and those are co-developed with Indigenous nations, and they really integrate landscape fire into the management of the broader landscape. I'm going to quickly touch on wildfire recovery. One of the questions was, well, where wildfire is going to happen, what can we do afterwards? And there's a ton on this, but there's kind of 3 or 4 major kind of chunks of work. The first is rehabilitation, and that's just the basics of cleaning up the mess that fighting a fire creates. Things like fire guards, natural drainage patterns, grass seeding. Some of this is controversial, like what kind of grass seed you use is actually a really important topic when you're trying to consider backcountry and whether you want invasive species and all those kinds of things. But there's a whole pile of work, and there's a lot of resources around how you appropriately rehabilitate. There's also some really interesting projects with some of the Indigenous people started at the, sorry, name escapes me, around Ashcroft, anyway, the big fires down there in 2017, and sort of pursuing a co-developed rehabilitation plan with Indigenous nations. The second part is reforestation. Some of these fires are burning such that the forest may not regenerate successfully after, particularly when they're really big and really hot. So there's a question whether or not you should replant, and whether or not you should, what type of species you should reforest with. So I'll just say it's, again, another big topic of conversation, but you do have an opportunity to reforest with more future-oriented, climate-friendly species. In some cases, you can just let it go and it turns into a grassland or a less forested site, and that's a good thing too. There is a question about salvage. How much salvage logging is appropriate after a fire, balancing sort of the economic priority with minimizing damage to the environment. And there's usually some sort of plans at a landscape level to figure that out on these big fires. And then there's sort of, so it actually should be ecologic restoration. There's a couple good examples, and I have a link to the Shovel Lake wildfire where the province and First Nations sort of co-developed a long-term ecologic restoration plan, looking at if there was high severity fires, should you put back different types of vegetation? What can you do looking forward that's very different to prepare that future forest for climate change? There's an example of planting some trees after a fire, and I do want to emphasize there's some really interesting opportunities to plant different species than we might have had, and think about the future of climate when you're planting those areas. I'll just quickly touch on some challenges. It's pretty clear that if you want to deal with the fire risk we've got to use these multiple tools on the landscape: cultural burning, prescribed fire, fuel management, planning to make sure it goes at the right spot at the right time. But there are challenges. The province is not well situated to deal with the scale of the problem we're seeing. We've got to see improved governance, how we make decisions, how we involve people at a local level. The scale of action, BC is a huge place. There's some really promising projects going on, but they're at a very small scale right now, and they need to scale up. And that means funding and resources. There's not enough people right now to do the level of work we want. There's some barriers around training requirements and things like that I won't get into. And simply, it's going to take a lot more resources fiscally. I will say there's also some tough choices. Sometimes your fuel management work may help you over the long term, but it might mean you have to go fuel manage near someone's favorite recreation trail, and they may not like that. And so there's going to be some social choices about how you bring back these kinds of activities on a land base that may be unfamiliar to people, they're worried about, they're nervous about. And that leads to social buy-in. When you do things like lighting a fire, there's a lot of people in communities who aren't familiar with fire and why it's necessary. They're concerned about the smoke that arises from fuel treatments and from prescribed burning, and they're not that supportive because they don't really see why we're doing it. And so there's a real challenge sometimes in getting these things off the ground for social buy-in. So that's some of the challenges. There's lots of more coming, and I did put in some resources. First Nation Emergency Services Society is growing and has just got some amazing capacity for fuel management, for planning, for treating in communities. The Forest Practices Board did a couple reports this summer around managing fire at the landscape level. And in the community forest world, there's I think one of the leading examples of how you do this at a local scale with a watershed focus is the Slocan Integral Forest Cooperative. They're doing some really neat stuff and have been at it for about 10 years. So I think they're leading the pack in the province on how to land this locally. So that's it. I hope that was helpful, and I guess we get to talk questions.
That was amazing, Kevin and Russell. Thank you so much for your presentations. If anybody wants to use the reactions or emojis to clap, really want to applaud you for the work and the hard work you put into the presentations, and really trying to share with us some really complex information, and to break it down for us in a way that was, like really understandable and easy for us to follow, like especially for us that, don't work in forestry. A lot of us work in fisheries or with water. So seeing the work and really seeing the important work done in community, Russell, just the ability to have captured all of that through your photographs and videos is really quite amazing to be able to share with Indigenous communities all over the province. We really thank you for that.